just gonna, okay, let me just minimize this little kind of a, my presentation has a sort of funny title, which was given to me by another group who wanted me to present. They thought it was a cute phrase, and bees do have knees. That doesn't really play a big part in my presentation, but I will get to that, because part of what is really fascinating about bees is how they actually pick up pollen from plants and bring it back to their hive. So this is a picture of one of my bee yards. It's behind my house. And I will just comment, though, I think it's a very nice picture. There's a couple of things wrong with how these beehives are set up. First of all, I don't have much choice in the matter, but you really need to put your beehives where it's sunnier than this. So these bees have too much shade and they're too close together. So I'll give you little tips like that as we go along. Okay, so in our presentation, we'll cover an introduction to the honeybee, who they are, where do they live. The honeybee is one of about 36,000 species of bees that live in North America. And what makes them different is they live in a colony. They can create quite a large population. They can sustain this colony over the winter. And they also put away more honey than they need for their own colony, their own family. So that makes them valuable to agriculturists and to people who want to keep bees as a hobby, because they are very productive. There are many native bees that are also pollinators. However, they are less movable in the grand scheme of things. You can't really ship them around. Honeybees live in colonies that are quite large, as I said, and they live in enclosures, either in nature or man-made. We'll talk about honeybee reproduction. And in addition to the honeybees reproducing on an individual basis, the colony itself, the family, will split. And that's part of what they do naturally. When the colony gets too large and it's big enough so that there are enough bees where they can divide and have a new queen to go with them, then they will separate. And that's called swarming. What do honeybees eat? Nectar and pollen, honey. And we'll talk about how in their gathering of the nectar and the pollen, they are able to do the pollinating of the flowering plants and how we can get honey from the hives. And then what can everyone do to help the bees, not just beekeepers? So the bees and wasps and hornets are often mistaken for one another by people who generally categorize stinging insects all at once. So the bees, though, and the wasps and the hornets belonging to the order of Hymenoptera do belong to different families within the insect species. So bees are apis, and the honeybees are known as Apis mellifera. That would be the Western honeybee. There are about 8 or 9 species, or subspecies, I should say, of honeybee around the world. But the Western honeybee, which is the one that was brought to this country, is the one that is the best at growing into a big colony and pollinating and producing honey. The bees have tiny hairs all over their body, so they appear fuzzy. They collect nectar and pollen, and they have 2 pairs of wings. The female bees, both the queen and all the workers, have stingers. And the worker bees, once they sting, will die because they have a barb on the end of their stinger, which sticks into the flesh of whatever mammal they have stung. And when the bee pulls away, the stinger is left, continuing to pump venom if you don't get it out. And then the bee loses its entrails as it pulls away with the stinger left behind. So it's important when you get stung to try to get the stinger out of you right away, usually moving sideways with a piece of, well, people say use your credit card, but who has that out in the bee yard, right? So you take something that's a little stiff and you put it along the side, or you can even brush it with your arm, or your hand rather, and get the stinger out before it gives you enough nectar. I'm sorry, enough venom to really provide a bad sting. Once a honey stings you, it also will attract other bees. So you also want to walk away as soon as you get stung. The bees evolved during the Cretaceous period, which was about 145 to 65 million years ago. And they evolved with the flowering plants. Prior to the angiosperms, or the flowering plants development, were the gymnosperms, which pollinate by wind. The angiosperms, on the other hand, rely on a creature like the honeybee or sometimes animals to take their pollen from one to the other. So this was a mutual evolution of these species. Now, the wasps are Hymenoptera, but in the family Vespidae, and this includes yellow jackets and hornets. You'll see that the wasp and hornet, if you observe them, do not look fuzzy. They don't have the little hairs on them. They look rather shiny. They do have that wasp waist, which is a greater definition between the parts of the body. And they will eat other insects and also nectar, but they are more carnivorous than vegetarian because they eat insects and larvae of other insects. They generally have 2 pairs of wings. The females have stingers, just as the honeybee, but they can sting repeatedly. So if you get stung by a yellow jacket, watch out. You better get that off you immediately. And it is hypothesized, but with strong evidence, that the honeybee actually descended from a solitary wasp, which turned from eating insects to consuming pollen as its protein source. So here's a picture of the bees. It's a little bit squished down, I think, because the drone isn't quite that fat, and sometimes the queen isn't quite that long. However, it does show a marked difference in the body types of the bees. You'll find that the queen is usually the longest bee in the hive. She is slimmer, and she has a longer, she's longer in the end because she lays eggs and has an ovipositor in there. They all have 3 sets of legs. They all have 2 pairs of wings. The job of the queen is to lay eggs and regulate the unity and functions of the colony. The bees communicate through various means, and one of the important ways they communicate with one another is through pheromones, in which they put off a chemical scent that is picked up to notify other bees of a certain situation. The queen has a combination of chemicals known as queen pheromone, and when the queen is active and well and young and very vigorous, she puts out a lot of queen pheromone. The worker bees who groom her will carry the pheromone throughout the hive, and the queen herself, as she walks through the hive, will leave traces of it. And so that alerts the other bees that the queen is alive and well and all goes well. So, when something happens to the queen in the hive, then the workers begin to become restless, and it's not a good situation. Now, the drone is the male of the bees, and the drones exist to mate with the virgin queens. They die after mating. Mating takes place up in the air. The virgin queen will fly very high in the air to what's called drone congregation areas, where the drones actually gather. So the drones can scent the virgin queen's pheromone, and they hang around and they wait in a bee yard. And when they know that there are new queens being hatched, they will start to gather around, and you might see them even outside the hive. But the drones do like to eat, and when all is well and the bees are bringing in plenty of provisions, the drones will eat. And the hive seems to be regulated nicely by the presence of the drones. The workers during prosperous seasons find them to be very easy to be with. And unfortunately, though, for the drones, when the weather gets colder and the bees are putting away food for themselves for the winter that they know they will need, they often will then just get the drones out of the hive, basically kick them out of the hive, because they don't want to waste their stores over the winter on the male bees who are in the hive, just taking up space and eating, so to speak. Now, the worker bees are the other type of female bee in the hive, and they are the smallest bee. The way they differ from the queen is they don't have an active reproductive system. They have never been mated, and so their ovaries are not developed. They have something, you know, something is there, but it's not active. They have the ability to make wax, which the queen and the drone do not have. They have wax glands on their underside. They have a certain structure to their legs, which allows them to gather pollen and efficiently pack it to take it back to the hive. So they are suited for all different tasks. And indeed, they do all the work in the hive, and they go through different stages as they age. So they would start out cleaning the hive, and we'll see more about how the hive is set up later. So here's the honeycomb. The honeycomb is created from wax. This picture was probably taken in a place that is quite warm, because around here, you might see honeycomb hanging from a tree. And I have indeed seen a swarm of bees making honeycomb in a leafy tree. However, they would never be able to sustain weather and wind. So this picture is useful just to show you how the comb is created with hexagonal cells. They're shaped like hexagons. The bees actually use their own bodies to form the cells, and then as they press them outward, they flatten on the 6 sides and press against each other. It's a very sound structure. The leaves of, so to speak, of honeycomb hanging down, which we sometimes refer to as lamb's ears because of their shape, are spaced a certain distance apart so the bees can go between them. And on these combs, the queen will lay her eggs. The worker bees will put away nectar, which is developed into honey, and all other activity takes place. So the worker bees mold the wax with their mandibles and make it very soft. It has to be quite warm to, excuse me just a minute. Okay, please forgive me. That was unanticipated. Okay, here's a picture of the worker bee with wax coming out of her wax glands. And it's generated in a sort of a liquid form onto what are called wax plates on the bottom of her abdomen, and flakes off into the hive, where other worker bees will pick it up and mold it with their mandibles and so forth, as we just learned. Okay, here by contrast is a wasp nest. Now you can see that the wasp nest is also made in the hexagonal cell shape. However, it's made by the wasp chewing on wood or other kinds of substances where they can create a paper-like molding substance, and they can stick it together with their saliva to form a nest. I'm not sure how they make their cells, probably about in the same way. I'm sure it's quite malleable when it's wet, but most of us, I think, have seen something like this. And though you certainly don't want it near your home, it is kind of a marvel of nature and certainly interesting to look at. So when we talk about the habitat, the beehive or hive is the physical home. The honeycomb we've seen is kind of the skeleton of the nest where the bees live. The colony is the family unit. So we have the hive, but then the colony can be in any enclosure, and the pheromones are released by the honeybee to regulate what's going on in the colony. The honeybee is native to Western Europe, or Western honeybee is native to Europe. There are about 10 species of bees all throughout Europe and Asia. It is thought that Asia was actually the cradle of civilization for honeybees, as it is for so many, I guess, for most of our other civilizations, but they had migrated to other continents, Africa and Europe. So the Western honeybee was brought to the Americas by European settlers in the 17th century. There's actually a ship's log from Jamestown that has listed 1620. It has a listing of several honeybee hives being brought in with the ship's cargo. Up in our area in New England and the mid-Atlantic, we had Dutch settlers, we had Swedish settlers, and we had the German settlers, of course, and the English. So these people all brought in their honeybees, and Spanish settlers brought in honeybees to the southern states, southern colonies, and to South America. As honeybees swarmed, as the hives divided and moved, they moved west. And they were taken by the North American settlers, but they also swarmed and so went ahead of the settlers, which is kind of interesting, kind of a precursor. Wild colonies could survive easily in hollow trees. There are still sections of forest in our country where wild honeybees live. Up in Ithaca, New York, where Thomas Seeley is a professor at Cornell University. He's written quite a number of very good books that I would recommend. Honeybee Democracy was the first book of his that I read, and it really did portray the bees in a very interesting way. But he studies wild bees in the Arnott Forest up there and sees how the colonies live in the hollow trees and how they divide. It is a healthy way for bees to live, and the colonies are smaller. So it's really interesting in contrast to how we may manage our large colonies of bees that we keep. Here's an example of how a honeybee colony looks in a hollow tree. This was a tree from Highland Park, New Jersey, the city, which was taken down, and the bees delivered in a chunk of the tree to a beekeeper friend of mine, where she had them on her property. And if you look, you can see, I don't know if you can see my little arrow, but you can see here how the comb is hanging parallel, just like it did on the tree. Here's two here, and you can see the bees behind. Now, this series of pictures I want to show you, I did not properly give written photo credit on it, but these were taken by your fellow master beekeeper, Shona Erlenborn, over at the Park Rangers building. One of the columns acquired, this colony in the column attracted notice. As you'll see from the pictures, it really had been there a while, but apparently the bees had become very noticeable and quite a nuisance in their quantity and in the path they were taking and flying back and forth. So the column had to be opened, and I was happy to be part of the party along with Shona and two other beekeepers who actually were part of this, what we call a cutout, where a beekeeper will extract from a building the bees that have lived there. So this is the column. Here's the little opening right here. So you can see how small the opening was. But if we move here is, now this gentleman is Christoph. He's a beekeeper who actually got up on the ladder and did the work. So the rest of us were very good support staff, but he was our star. You can see that the bees are in here, quite filling up, and this is a very large space. When I was notified that there was a swarm in the column over here, over there, the county park rangers. My first thought was that it was a swarm from one of my 4-H hives, because you know the 4-H center is quite close. However, in seeing this, I was reassured to know that if it was a swarm from the 4-H hives, it was one that had taken place two or 3 years ago. This was not a first-year beehive. This thing is huge. On this picture, you can see the combs. There weren't too many pictures that we could actually get a picture with the combs hanging there, because there were just so many bees, and they all came out, and they were really, you know, not too bad to handle. But it was a messy affair. Here, Christophe is cutting out part of the comb. That's how it had to be done, bit by bit, or chunk by chunk. And this comb, you will see the texture of here. That is all honey. That is all honey that has been waxed over by the bees. We call it capping. And so we had a lot of honey from that hive. This piece of comb, however, you can see, and I'll show you closer up in a moment, but this is all what we call brood. So this is, the queen has laid eggs in here, and the worker bees have been taking care of this larva. They covered it over with another kind of wax composition, which is brood capping. And so what we did was we put it into frames, such as the bees will live in when they are kept, with rubber bands, and we're able to transport them that way. So they went into a hive, and there was a story about those hives. I think Christophe had a couple of them. One of them swarmed, but then the other one survived. And so those bees live on, despite the fact that they were really very much displaced from their home. So this is just a graphic to show you the honeybee nest. So you can sort of imagine inside that column, we had all those bees, and then we had honey too. So that's the shape of what was going on in that column. Now, back to keeping bees by beekeepers. These are some of the earlier hives that we would have had. People kept bees in skeps. They were sort of upside down baskets, probably discovered by accident that bees would move into that. They could be kept in a chunk of tree, such as we saw, but intentionally kept in a chunk. It was called a log gum. Those were kept largely in the Appalachian areas. But the straw skep was quite commonplace in our part of the country. And most gardens, most kitchen gardens had a beehive or two outside to pollinate the plants and give them honey. This is a man-made hive, or manufactured hive. It was invented by a beekeeper named Lorenzo Langstroth in the 1840s in Philadelphia. He was a minister, and he suffered from nervous afflictions and found that beekeeping soothed him. And so he would observe the bees in nature, and he noticed that when the bees created their comb, which, as I pointed out earlier, they could move between the leaves of comb, they left a certain space, about 3/8 of an inch. And so he named that bee space. So he created this box system with the hanging down frames, spacing each of the frames 3/8 inch apart. And the boxes are such that you can add boxes when your hive gets bigger. In this particular graphic, which is fairly simplistic, I mean, we could do any number of kinds of combinations, and there are deep supers, which super is what we call the boxes. Super meaning there's the hive box, and the super you would put above. So you can stack many supers above the main box. The queen excluder, some people use to keep the queen confined to part of the hive. Some people don't use it. And then the honey supers would be where you would where the bees could put away extra honey. So there's some manipulation in this, as you probably can tell, where you want to make sure that you have enough room for the bees to live so the queen can have plenty of room to lay eggs. So typically you'd have more than one super where the bees would live. And on top of that, only after you are sure that the bees have enough honey for themselves do you add boxes that you will then extract the honey from for yourself. So here's another bee yard that I used to have. And this was a very nice bee yard. You can see it's in full sun. It's very beautiful. It's at the edge of a woods, which is kind of nice. It gives it shelter. But here's what was wrong with this bee yard. This bee yard was not accessible for me to drive to. This equipment can be very heavy and it's unwieldy. It's, you know, cumbersome to handle even when it's empty. So you're better off if you have an area where you can either drive a vehicle to, or you can have a big, you know, it's flat enough and even enough that you could take a big wheelbarrow or a wagon or something like that. And this was neither. And when it rained, it got mushy. So I had to move these bees, but it was a lovely environment for the bees. It was just hard for the beekeeper. Okay, well, here's a picture of a frame of bees. And this is a very lovely, lovely frame of bees. Now you'll see that the bees are all over it, but underneath, if you can see the little fuzzy brown parts here, that is all what we call capped brood. So when the queen lays her egg, the egg will develop after 3 days into larva. And then within another span of time, depending on whether we have a worker queen or drone bee developing, the larva will be capped over into a pupal stage. And the worker bees do that work. The worker bees feed the eggs, they feed the larva, they cap the larva. And then when the larva hatch, when the bee develops and hatches, they will clean the cell of the debris left by the new bee. Up here, there are a lot of bees, but you see there's a whole different texture. And this is honey. Typically what the bees do in their layout is they'll have a nice kind of an arc, we call that a rainbow, where they have all the brood and then the provisions. So there'll be typically nectar and pollen, and when the nectar is mature, it'll be capped over for honey. On this screen, I'll give you a moment. I think on this particular picture, the queen is rather easy to spot. But if you think about the picture we just looked at with all those bees, there's sometimes when you really just cannot find that queen. The bees have sort of separated nicely here. So I think you're seeing that she's here. You see she's longer. Her stripes are not as defined, so she appears to be kind of brown. But this is a very pretty queen, and you know, they're all nice. You know, bigger doesn't always mean better. There's small queens that do as well as large queens. Some people prefer, you know, they have a style they like, but it really doesn't matter if she's vigorous. Here is a frame which has honey capped, so you can see the difference. The new wax that's used to cap over the nectar, once it's mature enough to be honey, will be lighter in color because it's really pure wax. The cappings for the brood are a mixture of honey and pollen, a lot of pollen and some other substances, but it's usually older wax that is mixed in with the pollen to form the brood cappings. And you can see this is a box that has all honey in it. So we were looking at a nice harvest there. So I think I went over this, and in the interest of time, I'm hoping I can, you know, zip it up a little bit here. 3 stages of honeybee development. We talked about that. Oh, the queen determines whether she is going to lay a female or a male egg by fertilizing it. So, well, she lays the egg, but then she determines the sex by either fertilizing it from her spermatheca. So her ovipositor and her spermatheca are two separate features. And so once the egg is fertilized, then it develops into a female bee. The unfertilized eggs become the males, and they grow bigger in their cells. They take longer to develop. So you can recognize when you're looking at a frame with developing brood on it, you can recognize the cells that are for drones. The queen bee, there's usually the queen bee is not, there's usually one in the hive, And the occasions for wanting another queen are if something happens to the queen, if a colony swarms, because when the swarm occurs, the old queen leaves with the colony and a new queen must be made, or if the queen is very old and has not, or is somehow not producing enough eggs, then the queen pheromone is not abundant and the workers will decide it's time to develop a new queen. So the queen cells are a little bit different looking. And so when the queen lays an egg, because the queen cooperates in all this too, if she lays an egg in a queen cup or a queen cell, then the worker bees know to feed that egg with only royal jelly. And that is what determines its develop. Well, it helps with the development of a queen, because that makes a fertile female bee. So the bees are 3 days as eggs and 6 days as larvae, but then in the pupal stage, they develop for different periods of time, so that the drone takes 15 days to develop. The queen bee, the least number of days. So adding the 9 to the 15, the drone is 22, the queen bee is 16, and the worker bee is 21. So that's how we, that's their development times. Here's a picture that shows the larva. And I think we might have some eggs in here too, but I'm not sure. The egg looks like a tiny grain of rice and it is harder to spot, but you can see the larva is a pearly color. This means it's quite healthy. It's bathed in a nice pool of royal jelly and other nutritious substances that the bees give to the worker bees, as well as the royal jelly. Up here, we have some packed pollen in here. It's been treated with something, some honey and some other enzymes. And what we call that is bee bread. It has a sort of a shiny look to it. So this is a very nice example here with, we have so many things together. So we have the food, we have the larva, and we have the capped brood over here. And this bee here is cleaning out a cell. Down here is a different color pollen, by the way. Pollen comes in so many beautiful colors, as you probably know from your own work in the garden. So here's another picture of a frame. Again, we have that sort of rainbow pattern. Up here is pollen, more brood, and the queen lays in concentric circles. So this part's probably hatched out, and after the bees hatched out of it, because this is very dark, so that looks like brood comb where the brood has been. After that, maybe the bees will start putting some pollen in, or the queen will lay more eggs. And down here, close to the bottom, you see it sort of peters out, but it's a very nice pattern of brood here. So a little bit about swarming. Now we saw in the park ranger building how a swarm can live and develop into a really full-size colony. And at some point, that colony probably would have swarmed too, if it hadn't already in previous years. We just don't know how old it is. There's no way of telling. So in the swarming, the colony gets so big that the old queen and 60% of the worker bees or so, 2/3 or so, will depart to find a new home. In preparation for the swarm, the worker bees will stop feeding the queen as much. They will basically slim her down to make her a little bit more aerodynamic so she can fly, because once the queen comes back to the hive after her mating flight, she no longer has to leave. So although some people have determined that the queen can go on more than one mating flight, generally it's the case that she'll just stay in the hive for the rest of her life until she leaves with a swarm, if she does. So the swarm flies off. The worker bees have eaten a lot of honey and nectar in preparation for being able to create wax where they go. They fly off to a convenient spot which we call this bivouacking, where they just sort of hang around and kind of take a measure of their surroundings. The bees that would normally be going out to get nectar and pollen from the plants, they become bee scouts to go out and find a suitable permanent home. They're looking for a crevice somewhere in a tree or a building of a certain dimension. They like to be high up off the ground. They favor small openings, as you saw in that column with the park ranger building. And that way they're well protected, but with a nice crevice inside of something that's well protected by a very small opening, they can really, make a new home. That's why when you see a swarm hanging in a tree and it's not immediately caught, it will then disappear. So beekeepers like to be able to catch swarms because that means you can take them and put them in another box and establish a new colony. However, it's not always possible. Say you're working during the day and the bees swarm and you never know it because you have a high tree. I know that happened to me many times when I was still working. I missed a lot of swarms and would only notice later because the hive seemed depleted and there were queen cells in there that I might have had a swarm. So what remains in the hive will be the rest of the workers, so about a third of the workers and some drones. There will also be a preparation for new queens in the form of queen cells that are developing. And so if you notice that your hive has swarmed and you look in the hive and you see queen cells, you want to close it up and leave it until the queen has hatched out and had a chance to go on her mating flight. So for about 2 weeks, and then take a look and see. And if you see that eggs have been laid and larvae is developing, you see you have a laying queen and all is well. So here's a couple of pictures of swarms. This is one way up in a tree that my friend Charlie was cutting the branch on which the swarm is and handing it down to somebody else, not me. Here is a swarm at the 4-H center. If you are familiar with the layout of the 4-H center and you're facing the building, over on the right is the 4-H garden, and up on the hill by the railroad tracks are the beehives for our bee yard. In the middle of that area going up the hill, there's a sort of a stand of trees, which, by the way, contains 1 or 2 large ailanthus trees that Shona and I mangled lantern flies on last year. On one of these bushes, one of our 4-H hives decided to land its swarm. So fortunately, it was noticed by a groundskeeper and reported to the office, who then called me, and we were able to get it. But look how easy this one was. We didn't have to cut out anything. All we had to do was cut the branch and put it on top of a box with some frames in it. So then, as long as we have the queen, that's key. When you're dealing with a swarm, as long as you can capture the queen along with the bees, then you are in good shape, because what happens is the bees are very docile when they're swarming. They want to focus on gathering around the queen, and they're also very heavy from having eaten a lot of honey. So they're a little sleepy kind of. Those first couple of days when they're hanging around, they're just kind of getting their act together. So as long as you get the queen, that's fine. And the way you can tell is, so we put this branch on top of the box and shook it a bit, and the bees started going into the box. So that was a sign to us that the queen, giving off her pheromones, was in there, and the bees were going in after her. So we placed the hive, small hive, in the 4-H yard, and then left that for a day or two with the branch in the front to make sure that the bees had that familiar scent there from the branch, because their scent will be on the branch that they were on. Queen pheromone is still clinging to that. And then it went into a box, and here's the bees. They nicely fit in here, and we have extra space for them and some food. And that got covered up and made a new hive. Now, I mentioned in passing that the bees' food is nectar, pollen. Propolis is something else they collect, which they don't eat, but they use it to patch up any kind of cracks or crevices. It's known as bee glue to some. Propolis is made from tree resins. If you have a tree that has some kind of, if you can see the sap on the outside of a tree sometime, almost an amber in color. on many trees, and the bees will collect that, and then they will add their own enzymes to it to make it usable. Propolis has been found to contain antimicrobial properties. So when the bees coat, they sometimes will coat the inside of the hive boxes with it, and it's thought to be a sort of a natural preventative measure for them to keep them healthy. They don't really have an immune system, but they have ways of kind of taking care of themselves. So the nectar is their carbohydrate, and the pollen is their protein. When the bees collect pollen, you may know that they are attracted to flowers that are purple, violet, and blue, but they don't see red. There is an interesting video that I found that I can share with Rosalind or the group somehow, if you like, sometime, that is just a changing picture of all different flowers, showing them in 3 different ways: the ways that humans see them, the ways that butterflies see them, and the way that honeybees see them. And it's very interesting to see how the spectrum, the color spectrum of each of those types of creatures is different. So the honeybees, when they visit the flowers, are usually out to get the nectar, and accessibility is everything. Certain plants are not pollinated by honeybees simply because of the structure of the flower. The honeybee's mouth parts form what's called a proboscis, and they must be able to put it down into the nectar, into the nectaries of the flowers in order to draw that out. In gathering the nectar, they will brush against the anthers of the plant, and pollen will stick to them on the many little hairs that are on their bodies. When they visit the next flower, and bees do tend to go to a particular type of flower at once. In other words, they go to many different plants. However, they will sort of exhaust one rich source of nectar before they go on to another one. So as they go from flower to flower, they will then brush off the pollen on the pistil of the next flower. And so they are incidental pollinators. When they pick up the pollen, they will carry it back to their hives. On their pollen baskets, they groom themselves and position it on their leg so that they have little chunks of pollen that they can pack very tightly. And then they will transfer the pollen from their legs into the cells, sometimes with assistance of other bees. So pollination, we've all been through this before. We know that the crop species that the bees are pollinating make up a large amount of our food. So the pollinators as a whole are mostly beneficial insects. The wasps and hornets actually do a bit of pollinating of their own. It's not a lot, but they do. I wish I knew more about which plants they go to, but they are significant in that way. But the native bees are really very good about particular crops. For example, there is an orchard bee that is beneficial to fruit trees. Now, the Western honeybee, though, because it is pretty much omnivorous, is the most efficient managed pollinator. However, in transporting bees from place to place, they do acquire different diseases. And so a lot of times, beekeepers who are the pollinating, they're making their living by pollinating, they find that they lose colonies more and more every year. So the use of native pollinators and wild bees is being explored in that way too, and also to try to save these pollinators as well. There are experiments being done with bumblebees as pollinators in greenhouses. So here is the bee's leg. They have 3 pairs of legs. However, I will show you the front and the rear. When they groom themselves with the pollen on they start with their antlers. And so they have a little brush and antenna cleaner in that first joint there, where they actually squeeze that around the antenna to get all the pollen off of that. The pollen on their head, they groom off too, and they pass the pollen back to the next set of legs, going across their body. So the front right leg would pass to the middle left leg, and from the middle left leg back to the right rear leg, all the while grooming across the body. So in the rear leg, that's where the really interesting activity takes place. Once the pollen is groomed down to this base of tarsus here, it is then pressed up into this little joint so that it is forms into a kind of a ball. Pollen is coated with a sticky substance called pollen kit. And so the grains of the pollen will stick together. It is squashed in here, and then it is described in literature as like squeezing a toothpaste tube, where it is pushed up onto this sort of concave area here on this part of the leg, which is known as the corbicula. Now, corbicula means basket in Latin, so this is known as then the pollen basket. Some people call them the bee's pollen pockets. And here's a picture of how a very well done pollen piece is on the pollen basket. There's a big central hair there too that comes out of the corbicula that the pollen actually packs around to give it some height. And here's one of my hives. You can see right here we have some lovely pollen coming in here. Talked about this a little bit, nectar to honey. The forager uses her mouth to suck up the nectar. The honeybee has a feature called the crop or honey stomach, which is above her regular stomach, her digesting stomach. And it's separated from the regular stomach by the ventriculus, so it's called the proventriculus. The forager will come back to the colony with the nectar. In the meantime, she has added enzymes from her body. You know, think of the honeybee as like a little chemistry lab there, because they often generate substances and chemicals that will help in the preservation of the pollen and the nectar. So that's part of the process. Instead of taking the nectar right up to the honeybee comb and putting it away herself, as the bees with the pollen do, the forager with the nectar will take and put transfer the honey to the nectar to another bee waiting at the entrance. And so those are the receiver bees. The receiver bees will go up through the colony then and may pass this nectar from bee to bee until it reaches its spot where it is deposited. Each bee that receives the nectar will add a little bit of the enzyme. So the honey is processed in that way, or the nectar is processed in that way, and the honey will also, sitting in the cells as it does, the humidity has to be regulated. It can only have a certain water content in order to last. In other words, if it is going to be preserved, the water content can be no more than 18.5%. So ideally, you would have 15 to 18% in your honey. So if it's higher than that, it will ferment in the hive, and that is very, very bad. It's quite unpleasant. The bees will then fan the nectar in the cells with their wings, and they will reduce the humidity until it is the proper percentage, and then they cover the nectar over with wax. So the composition of honey is here. You can see it's largely fructose and glucose, and we have water moisture 17.1%, which is ideal. It is it's said that honey has a lower glycemic index, so I'm not sure what that means, but there you have that. So health benefits of honey. We know that some are scientifically proven, and we know that some are quite devotedly followed as natural or homeopathic treatments. Scientifically proven uses of honey medically are, first of all, as a cough suppressant. This is especially effective in children ages 2 and up. We never give honey to children less than a year old, although I had somebody tell me recently that that's not true anymore. I believe it's better to be safe and not, not flaunt that old recommendation, is that honey does contain a certain amount of botulism spores. And when we're a year old and older, we have developed a resistance to this type of spore. However, young children may not have that resistance, and so it could make them sick. Another treatment that is popular in Europe and Australia, particularly, is wound treatment. If you put honey on an open wound or a burn, it has natural antibacterial properties due to honey's content of hydrogen peroxide. It has a rather high content of hydrogen peroxide. I think we've all heard of Manuka honey. That's coming out of New Zealand and Australia. And it seems to have very good medicinal properties for wound treatment and burns. And it has a slightly higher hydrogen peroxide content. So that's kind of interesting. Then another very popular use of honey, particularly with people who have seasonal outdoor allergies, is to seek out local honey to eat to build immunities to these plants that are providing them with allergic reactions. This can be questioned, however, as most seasonal allergies are the result of wind-borne pollen, and the honey that we have is from plants that are pollinated by insects. So their pollen doesn't really blow around. So I'll just leave you with that. But it's still, honey is still really soothing. It's really delicious. And on the whole, it's a very healthy food. It's a little picture of some different color honeys. It's always interesting to go to a honey stand and see what people have to offer. Depending on the time of year, your honey will be light or dark. If you have honey taken off your hives in the very early spring, when dandelions and trees are providing them with the pollen that they are bringing in and the nectar, you'll have a very light honey. The darker honey in the late summer and fall is the product of Japanese knotweed, an invasive species that unfortunately the bees love. Sometimes we're forced to realize that we don't want these plants, and yet the bees are making use of them. And then in the middle of the season, we have other plants giving the bees what they need. Most of what we have in New Jersey, we would have to categorize as wildflower honey. Bees will fly anywhere from 2 to 3 miles radius to get their resources. And if they really have to, they'll fly as far as 5 miles. So unless we had property with many acres of one plant on it, where the bees were foraging, and then we were able to remove the honey from the hive right after that bloom season was over, then you can say you have, for example, blueberry honey from South Jersey, or cranberry honey, or in places where they have a lot of buckwheat fields, you could have buckwheat honey, or any of those varieties, but it has to be on property that's substantial enough to provide enough of that nectar for the bees to use that for that honey. And you have to remove it right away. So in our state, where everybody is very close together, it's a little hard to say, where your bees have been. So what can we do to help the honeybees and other pollinators? Well, one of the things that's happening is that the bees are suffering nutritionally because the variety of food that they are accustomed to if they live in a wild area can be reduced greatly by development. So I think a lot of people are aware that, you know, bringing back the wildflowers on the highways and leaving an area of your property a little wilder so that you can have some attractive enough looking wildflowers and weeds that the bees love. That's always beneficial. For the native bees, it's good not to disturb too much ground. In other words, don't mow everything. But as gardeners, you know all that. You know, I've seen the layout of your pretty teaching garden, and you're very mindful of these things. But not everybody is. Unfortunately, in my suburban area up towards Martinsville, there are many lawn care trucks that go by, and I just don't know what kind of chemicals might be on the plants that the bees are foraging on. But hopefully, because they do fly so far, they're getting a good diet that's diluted. There are ways to put pesticides on, and again, as gardeners, you know all that. One significant health problem that beekeepers have to face is that when you have managed colonies, you are definitely going to have to deal with a particular mite that has grown in, it just seems to have taken over basically in the last 30 years. So the Varroa mite was native to Asia, and it coexisted with the Asian honeybees over there who were, they pretty much the bees had a tolerance for them. However, once that particular mite got into this country, probably on a shipment of bees, we then found that our Western honeybee is not resistant. And it's very difficult because putting our hives too close together can be a problem. Having a lot of hives, anywhere together. Or what happens is if you have neighbors who don't treat their bees for Varroa mites, then those bees might be foraging on the same plants as your bees, and they could pick up the mites from the plants even. Some of the wild bees are affected by Varroa mites, although not too many. But we have to treat the hives, and unfortunately, we're still trying to strike a balance because there are different kinds of treatments, and there are soft chemicals, there are hard chemicals. Some people do try to manipulate their hives so that they, can, if you divide your hive, it gives a break to it. So the reason why that is that the Varroa mite will be inside the cell with the larva. It'll get into the larva. And when the cell is capped over, then the Varroa mite will reproduce in the cell. And when the bee hatches, it will have then been subject to the Varroa mite feeding on it. The Varroa mite will also feed on adult bees. So it's both a pest of the brood and a pest of the adult bees. And what it does is it will attack both its circulatory system, which is called the hemolymph or the blood, and it will also attack the fat body, which is its reserves of protein, and also where any kind of quote unquote bee immunities might lie, and it will devour those. It also vectors diseases. So in other words, there are diseases like the bent wing virus, black queen virus, where your queens will turn sort of, it attacks the queen. The bent wing virus will cause deformed wings on the bees. And then there are other, like nosema is another disease that a weakened colony can succumb to. So not only vectoring diseases, but weakening the colony. The Varroa mite does a lot of damage. With nutritional issues, sometimes we have to supplement the feed, giving extra pollen or sugar to the colonies. And we need to manage the colonies to avoid overcrowding so that they don't swarm, or which means dividing the colony yourself. And that works out very well. So do we have time for a little video? Do you think this will show? It's 11.
How long is the video?
Oh, maybe 4 minutes or so.
Yeah, we can go ahead.
Okay. Oops.